You're listening to the Beyond Measurements and Image podcast, where we build healthier lifestyles, elevate your well-being, and transform lives. Welcome to BMI.
I'm your host, Dr. Drew Crawford. I'm a board-certified gastroenterologist and obesity medicine specialist. Thank you for joining me today on Beyond Measurements and Image. Today, we're going to talk about intermittent fasting. Intermittent fasting has been wildly popular lately with some varying results, but generally I think it tends to have good results and it's pretty manageable and pretty sustainable. So what is it? Well, it is just exactly what it says. You intermittently fast. You eat for a certain amount of hours each day, and then you fast for the remaining part of the day. And it's set. I mean, you could kind of say, well, gosh, we always intermittently fast, right? In fact, the word breakfast comes from breaking the fast, right? When you go to bed, you fall asleep. You obviously aren't eating while you're sleeping. And when you wake up, your first meal, you break the fast. But it's more prolonged than that. And we're really wired well to do that because back in, prehistoric times when we were sort of running around either hunting or gathering, even early farming, food as a resource wasn't always readily available. So a lot of times we had prolonged periods of time between meals. And so when we would eat a lot, and then our body's very proficient at storing excess calories. And that's one of the problems is here in 2026, we don't have problems with resources, the majority of us, at least in Western society. That's a great problem to have. But what happens is our body is so wired to deal with the excess calories so that we can store it, so that when we go on these long periods of times where we don't have food, we can break it down and use the excess stored calories that we had at one time. We can use it to get us through those periods of time. But in 2026, at least in Western civilization here in the U.S., we don't really have that problem. And in fact, what we're finding is we have just the opposite problem. Our body is so well wired at managing excess calories and storing it. The way that manifests is just significant obesity because it does just exactly how it's wired to do. It takes excess calories and stores them. It fills our muscles and our liver with glycogen, and then it stores everything else as fat. When we just turn around and eat 3 meals a day plus snacks, we never need to tap into those stores, but the body continues to assume that we won't have calories in the very near future. And so it continues to store calories just like that. So that's kind of primitively how we landed up with this obesity issue. It's a great wiring system that we have to help us to survive. But as luck would have it, we don't have that exact need for survival any longer, and we're still wired that way. That's the basic gist of historically why this is so beneficial. So how do we implement intermittent fasting? Well, the two most prominent ways that we see done are with a 16-hour fast and an 8-hour feeding window. And so every day it would be the same 16-hour fast and 8-hour window. It's not variable. It's not really based on what you need it to be. You just sort of make the commitment of when you want to fast and when you want to eat. And then you stick to that. Now, that's not to say that you can't have some variation in it. And of course, you can always just break it at any time. But we'll talk a little bit about the physiologic benefits and how it works. And so if you have a set time, it really works best. Just thinking about a typical day for most people who work an 8 to 5 type of job, I would think that your 8 hours of feeding would probably be best served from about 11 in the morning to 7 in the evening. That is your feeding time. And then your fasting time is from 7 in the evening until the following day at 11 in the morning. And if you just do that consistently, that's how you set up a program for intermittent fasting. The second way that we see commonly done is a 5-2. And what it is it's 5 days on and then 2 days of fasting. So let me talk just a little bit about the 5-2, and then we'll go back to the 16-8 because the 16-8 is much more common and I think probably meets with a little more success, although I don't have any pure evidence of that. So on the 5-2, in a 7-day week, you can eat regularly on 5 of those 7 days. Now, the only caveat to the 2 days is you don't want them to be consecutive. You want them to be non-consecutive days. And they don't have to be the same. It doesn't have to be, say, like every Monday and Thursday. So on the 16-8, I said it really works best if you're consistent. But on the 5-2, it gives you a little more flexibility. So if you know you have dinner plans on a certain day or you have a wedding to go to or an event, there's more flexibility. Just the one carve out of that is you want to really make sure that you don't have those 2 days of fasting on consecutive days. You really want to separate those. So on the 5 days on, if you're using this as a weight loss plan, you want to be cognizant on those 5 days on, and you don't want to eat 3,000 calories if you're trying to lose weight. Have appropriate portion control and try to eat the right mix of, protein and fat and carbohydrates like we've talked about in all the other podcasts. And then you want to try to maybe have a little bit of a calorie deficit on those days. But even if you didn't, if you just wanted to go with your normal calories, just don't go overboard. And then on the 2 days off, the 2 days where you're fasting, what you'd want to do is you would want to go 24 hours without eating, or you can have a little bit of food, right? You can have, say, somewhere between 500 and 600 calories on those days, and then nothing else. So that's the 5-2. Now, on the 16-8, remember we talked about 8-hour feeding, and I suggested that maybe the 11 a.m. to 7 p.m. window may be the best. And in that, again, you can eat whatever you want. There's no specific restrictions on diet. If you're using this for weight loss, I would say again that you don't want to cram in 3,000 calories in that period of time. You want to really be cognizant of what you're eating. You want to try to eat healthy and do the things that you would do as if you were losing weight. But you don't have to necessarily significantly calorically restrict during those 8 hours. And then on the other 16 hours, you don't eat anything. You can drink water, and you can have zero sugar beverages, and you can have unsweetened coffee and unsweetened tea. This is not a hydration fast, so you want to make sure that you're getting plenty of hydration in whatever form. But that can't be sugary drinks. It can't be anything with calories. So how does intermittent fasting work? Well, we've talked before about insulin, and I'll just do a quick review. And I know it seems like every podcast I'm saying the same thing, but it's just worth understanding and just really wrapping your head around it. And in intermittent fasting, you'll begin to see really some of the benefits of having that knowledge. When we eat, we take in fats and carbohydrates and proteins, and carbohydrates particularly raise our blood sugars. And so when our blood sugars go up, our pancreas, the beta cells of our pancreas, secrete insulin, and it goes into our portal vein and it raises our insulin levels. And so that's good because when you have all the excess sugar and all the carbohydrates, you need to drive that energy into the cells. And so insulin helps to drive all the sugar into the cells, and it brings your blood sugar down. So insulin goes up when the sugar goes up, and the insulin drives that in, and then the sugar comes down, and your insulin consequently comes down as well. Well, remember, insulin, it does a couple things. Insulin, when you have elevated insulin levels, that does two things in particular. I mean, obviously it drives the sugar into the cells, but it also kicks our body into what we call lipogenesis. So when you have excess insulin, it promotes the storage of fat. Remember, we talked about in prehistoric times how our body is so wired to store excess calories. And one of the hormones that mediates that is insulin. So you have elevated insulin levels, and then it is wired to take those excess calories, and you fill your muscles and your liver with glycogen, which is stored glucose. But then you also begin to store the free fatty acids into fat cells, into lipocytes. That's what we think of when we think of like subcutaneous fat or just, peripheral fat. That's what an elevated insulin level does. So in addition to promoting lipogenesis, genesis meaning the formation of, lipo meaning fat, lipogenesis, the formation of fat, in addition to promoting lipogenesis, it inhibits lipolysis, which is the breakdown of fat. So if we have elevated insulin levels, excess calories first stored as glycogen, then the excess calories become stored as fat under the direction of insulin. I heard someone say the other day that insulin insulates, and I think that's a good reminder. So the elevated insulin levels takes the excess calories, stores them as fat, and more importantly, or equally as important, is it inhibits your body's ability to break down fat. So that's what insulin does. So you say, well, gosh, why are we going over this? We're talking about intermittent fasting. If you eat for 8 hours, that process goes on. And then what happens is at the end of the 8-hour period, you stop eating. And then once you start fasting, then your body begins to work on those excess stored calories. So initially, when you have calories in your belly, when you have calories in the system, your body's going to burn through those. But once you've burned all the calories that you've eaten, then it has to start looking to the stores, right? The fat stores, the glycogen stores, all of the stores that we have to then provide energy for our body. And that's where intermittent fasting works, because when you're not eating, you don't have these acute spikes in your insulin level. Now, there are people who have hyperinsulinemia, either just because they sort of have a metabolic syndrome, or maybe they have a very rare tumor called an insulinoma, right? But I'm not talking about those people. I'm talking about just regular old folks, right? What happens is we're not eating, we're not taking in these carbs. So in theory, our insulin levels shouldn't be high. And that allows our body to then break into those excess fat stores. First of all, it'll kind of work through the glycogen to a point, right? The stored glucose in our muscle and liver. But then at some point, it begins to break down some fat cells for energy and produce ketones. Because remember, we can function on ketones as a fuel as well. So that's the basis of the keto diet that we discussed in detail in episode 22. If you haven't listened to that, I would encourage you to go back and listen to that. And at some point, we may want to revisit that episode as well. But if our body is in a fasting state for 16 hours, really, it doesn't happen in the first bit of the 16 hours. Really, it only happens kind of in the trailing 4 or 5 hours, the last 4 or 5 hours, because it takes our body about 12 hours to kind of cycle through everything, the calories that we've taken in, and then also the glycogen. It doesn't completely deplete our glycogen stores, but then it starts to sort of move over to fat and break down fat. And then we can begin to use fat broken down into ketones as our fuel source. And that's how intermittent fasting works in terms of weight loss. Because what happens is if you're going 16 hours a day, every day, not eating, you begin to kind of tap into those fat stores. And if you're not taking in so many calories in the 8 hours that you're offsetting the breakdown of the fat, then you get a net negative energy balance. In other words, you begin to lose weight because you start to break into those fat stores, which that's ultimately how you would lose weight in the first place, is we take in less calories than we burn. And when we do that, our body, it needs the difference in calories that we haven't taken in. And so it taps into those resources. And so what we're doing is, instead of just doing it hardcore, not eating 500, 600, 700 calories less per day, instead of doing that, we're eating sort of regular for 8 hours, and then we're spending the remaining 16 hours breaking it down. Let's think about a hybrid car for a minute, if you can just bear with me on this analogy. So when you have a hybrid vehicle, there are two sources of energy. There's the typical combustion engine that burns gas, and then there's an electric motor powered by a battery. And so what happens is the car itself has computers, and it's designed to optimize the efficiency of the vehicle by kind of going back and forth between the combustion engine and the battery. And so both of them have their benefits. The electric motor really does well sort of around town, low speed driving, acceleration. And then the combustion engine's good at higher speed and also has some ability to recharge the battery. And then sometimes even when you apply the brakes, the energy that is generated from applying the brakes and slowing the car down actually can then be transformed and go back into the battery. So by having two forms of energy, you maximize the efficiency of that particular vehicle, whether it's a Tesla or a Prius or any of these things. That's different than an electric car that just has a battery, and it's different than a combustion engine that just has a gas-powered motor. So it's back and forth. So the intermittent fasting kind of allows us the same flexibility for energy sources. If you had a hybrid car, and let's just say that it only switched over when it was getting sort of low on fuel, that's not how they work. But let's just say for this, that's how it works. If every time the car was getting low on fuel, you pulled into the gas station and topped it off, then you would never kick into that battery power. Now, again, that's not exactly how hybrid cars work. But in this analogy, just imagine that every time your gas level got low, instead of switching over as needed, it switched over when your gas level got low, and then you had battery backup. Well, that's essentially what our body does with breaking down fat and developing ketones as a source of fuel, as opposed to just regular food. If every time you get hungry, you go get calories and eat them. You go to the grocery store, you go to the refrigerator, you stop by McDonald's. Every time you're hungry, you stop and you get some food and you fill yourself up. That's like topping your car off with gasoline. It never needs to ever think about switching over to that battery for power. If you go for 8 hours and you fill your body up with food and you eat regularly, then what happens is it burns through those. But then at the end of the feeding period, the end of that 8 hours, you stop eating. So your body's going to continue to burn the food that it's eaten. And then once it's gone through all that, then it's going to start looking to the stored sources, right? It's going to start looking at the alternative energy sources available. It's going to look at that battery in the hybrid car. And so in this situation, initially it goes with the glycogen, the stored glucose, because that's easier to break down and it's more readily available, primarily through the liver, but also through skeletal muscle. And then at some point, it doesn't want to break all of that down. So then it switches into our fat stores and it breaks our fat down and develops ketones. And that's the true alternative energy that I'm talking about. And so if you do that for basically, 4 to 6 hours a day, and you say, well, gosh, I'm fasting for 16 hours. Why am I only getting 4 to 6 hours of ketosis? Well, because it takes the remaining part of that time. Let's say the initial 10 hours, you're burning through the food that you've eaten, and then you're kicking into your glycogen stores, and then you start to get into that. And let's just say you do 5 hours a day of ketosis. Let's say you get true 5 hours of ketosis. Over the course of a week, that's 35 hours. It's 35 hours of your body being in ketosis. And then same could be said on the 5-2, except for in theory, it may be closer to 48 hours. It's probably not quite 48 hours because remember you're allowing yourself about 500 calories, 500 to 600 calories a day. You have to take out some for that. So you're getting about the same amount of ketosis over the course of a week with either the 16-8 or the 5-2. It's just kind of a matter of how you would like to structure it. So what can you eat during your feeding time? Well, the answer to that is you can essentially eat anything you want. What I think is best is that you eat a diet that's relatively high in protein. Ideally, if you could set it to where you could get about a gram of protein per pound of body weight, that would be perfect. And then supplement the rest of the calories for the day with fats and then to some extent carbohydrates. You don't want to necessarily be on too low a carbohydrate diet in this situation because you don't want to kick into ketosis during the fed state, but that would be very difficult to do. Really, to get into ketosis and maintain in ketosis, we're talking about 20 grams of carbohydrates over a 24-hour period, somewhere in that area. It's really quite low. Anything you want to eat for those 8 hours. Again, if weight loss is your goal, you want to make sure that you're, not exceeding the calories that you would normally take in for the day. Because in the end, remember the calories in and calories out equation still works. Doesn't matter if you're intermittent fasting, if you're taking a GLP-1, if you've had surgery, doesn't matter. Calories in, calories out is ultimately the final equation that really determines whether or not you lose weight or gain weight. The one thing about this, though, I think is important to know, I think is a little caveat that may be overlooked by a lot of people, is the last meal that you eat during your fed state. So let's say you're eating from 11 a.m. to 7 a.m. So that means your evening meal is probably going to be somewhere around 6. So I would suggest that meal, you would be best served if you did not have a lot of sugar and a lot of carbohydrates in that meal. Because what happens when you do that is you get the elevated insulin levels that we kind of initially talked about. Protein and fat, you don't get such big rises in insulin. But if you have a banana split and a Coke as your last meal, not only do your sugars go sky high, but your insulin levels go sky high. And when your insulin levels go up, right, even though you're going to fast then for the next 16 hours, you still have those elevated insulin levels. Those have to come down because remember, those actually are anti-ketotic. They are the ones that promote the production and storage of fat, and they inhibit the breakdown of fat. So if your last meal of your fed state is super high in carbs and sugar, you're working against yourself a little bit. So instead of getting, the full 4 to 6 hours of ketosis toward the end of the fasting period, you may shorten that. And you're just better off if you don't have elevated insulin levels at any point during the day. And if you can keep your blood sugar down and you can cut sugar out altogether, that's even better. The answer to the question of what can you eat during the feeding period, the answer is essentially anything. But I just think the caveat to that would be your last meal of that 8 hours should be relatively low in carbs and sugar. Another reason for that is that although your insulin levels kind of tend to follow the circadian rhythm, so normal insulin levels just in the general population, they tend to be a little bit higher, sort of midday, say, from 12 to 6, right? Just kind of during the circadian rhythm, they sort of come up in the morning and then they kind of work their way down. Insulin levels aren't particularly high in the evening for most people. However, insulin resistance is the highest. So the cell's ability to accept insulin and what it's trying to do is diminished in the evening. And so oftentimes what happens is if you have insulin resistance, if your cells aren't responding to the insulin, then the pancreas creates more insulin. And so then you can have elevated insulin levels. Now, just across normal healthy subjects, when you look at them, they don't really have particularly elevated insulin levels, but there is some innate insulin resistance amongst all people in the evening hours. And so that's just another reason to not eat a super high carbohydrate or sugary meal as your last meal during the feeding period of intermittent fasting. From that point on, if your time is up at 7 p.m., and from then on, you don't eat. You just don't eat. You can drink. Remember, you can drink water, 0-calorie beverages, coffee or tea, although coffee and tea at night isn't great, right? Because that messes with your sleep. And then when you mess with your sleep, it really messes with your cortisol level. And then cortisol level increases your insulin level. So avoid caffeine later in the evening. So that's how intermittent fasting works. And that's how I think it would be well structured. What are the benefits to intermittent fasting? Is it just weight loss? And the answer to that is no. Man, there's really a lot of benefits to intermittent fasting. For one, it's been shown to improve cognition. It's also been shown to improve blood pressure and to improve resting heart rate. In mice, they did a study and they found that they had more endurance with intermittent fasting. Now, you may feel a little sluggish and you may not necessarily feel any of these benefits, particularly increased endurance in the first few weeks of intermittent fasting. But nevertheless, it's there. What we know is young men, when they were studied, they actually lost fat with intermittent fasting. However, they were able to preserve their muscle mass better than other weight loss programs. Weight loss is a benefit of intermittent fasting. It also has been shown to decrease your fasting glucose and your fasting insulin levels, which is kind of how that works. It also decreases leptin levels. Remember, leptin's the hunger hormone. So as your leptin goes up, it tells you that you're hungry and you go back and eat. If you have decreased leptin levels, you have less stimulus and less drive to go eat. It also has been shown to improve insulin resistance, and it's been shown to increase a hormone called adiponectin. So what is adiponectin? Well, adiponectin is one of a bunch of what we call adipokines. And adipokines are hormones that are specifically secreted from fat cells. Fat cells aren't just cells of fat that just sit there and are inert and don't do anything. They actually secrete hormones. There's a whole almost microbiome that goes on. And some of it's beneficial and some of it's not. But interestingly, adiponectin is secreted by the fat. However, it's inversely related to fat mass. So in other words, if you're really fat, then your fat actually makes less adiponectin. And if you're leaner, the fat cells you have makes more adiponectin. And so what's the benefit? Well, it's an insulin sensitizer. It's a hormone that goes out and makes all the other cells more receptive to insulin and what insulin can do. And remember, insulin sensitizers are good. It's the opposite of insulin resistance. Patients who are oftentimes obese, oftentimes diabetics, and definitely patients with the metabolic syndrome have insulin resistance. So they have elevated insulin levels and the cells are just sort of ignoring the insulin. The insulin's knocking on the door, trying to drive glucose into the system so that the insulin level can drop so that you get all the benefits of a lower insulin level. But the cells aren't having it. They're resistant. So adiponectin is a sensitizer to insulin. So it goes around and sort of sensitizes all the other cells so that they're more receptive to what the insulin needs to do so that the insulin level can drop. Adiponectin is also an anti-inflammatory, which has been shown to decrease some endothelial cell lining inflammation, which is the blood vessel lining, which can lead to some improved cardiovascular outcomes. It's interesting. Leaner people actually make more adiponectin, which then in turn sensitizes the leaner people's cells to be more responsive to the insulin to get the insulin level back down. So it's kind of the old thing, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, right? If you're big, you make less of this adiponectin, which is a beneficial hormone. You'd think just intuitively that you would make more because it comes from fat cells. And if you're fat, you have more fat cells, but not the case. And then one other thing that intermittent fasting does is it promotes autophagy. And say, gosh, what is that? Well, autophagy is just kind of the way the body goes in and sort of cleans up damaged and broken down cells and cells that just have irregularities in them. You sort of liken it to like a business. If you have a business and it's going, let's say it's a 24-hour a day business and there's just always activity going on. it just gets messy, right? I mean, literally, like the office space would just get messy, and maybe the copier breaks, and you just figure out a way to kind of patch it together so that it works, but it doesn't work as well as if you shut the office down for a few hours and went in and cleaned up the office and fixed the copier and refilled the stapler and did all the things that you need to do in an office to make that office run much more efficiently when it's open. So that's what autophagy is, right? Autophagy is where the body goes in and it just kind of looks at these malformed or these broken down or damaged cells, and it actually kind of just cleans them up and breaks them down, uses the parts that it needs to, and then basically rejuvenates and promotes better cell production. And so it's a lot like just having a big office and shutting it down at night and having people come in and clean it and restock the shelves and fix everything and make it to where it works better. And so autophagy is that process with our cells. And if you're always running and gunning, and if you're eating nonstop, you eat throughout the day, you eat 3 meals a day, you eat snacks, you never break into any sort of fasting period, that's the equivalent of never shutting the office down and being able to go in and clean it. So in addition to better blood pressure control, heart rate control, insulin control, glucose, in addition to all that, just allowing our body to work on itself, to allow the autophagy to go in there and clean up these damaged cells. And you're right. In 16 hours each day, it doesn't get it all completely done. But if you're doing that day in and day out, and if it's something that you can really adapt as a lifestyle, it's actually been shown to improve longevity. And it's probably a lot of it is due to this autophagy, that and likely the weight loss component. So that's all the great things about intermittent fasting. So what are the downsides? Well, I don't know if there's any downside. It's a little bit difficult. It's probably not something that's just super easy to do, particularly if you eat all the time, right? So maybe going straight to a 16-8 may not be the best way to do it. Maybe you start with a 12 and 12. The nice thing is if you sleep 8 hours a day, that 8 hours by definition falls into the fasting period. Let's say you start with a 12-hour feeding window and a 12-hour fasting window. 8 hours of your fasting window, you're asleep. So you really only have to fast 4 hours. So maybe you do 2 hours before you go to bed. You don't eat anything. And in the first couple hours, you're up. You don't eat anything. And you slept for 8 hours. And that's your 12-hour fasting window. Now, do you get as much benefit? Probably not, right? I mean, you're just right there kind of at that cusp of when you start to break into ketosis. But it's a way to start. Don't let perfection get in the way of good enough. If you start there and you find that that's good, then maybe you can bump it up to 14-hour fasting window, and then you can bump it up to 16. Or maybe go with the 5 and 2. That's up to you. But who is this not good for? That's probably the real question. I don't think there's a lot of downsides to it other than you just kind of got to work on the discipline. But who's it not good for? Well, it's not good for pregnant people. It's not good for type 1 diabetics as a general rule. You would have to have a really dedicated, really smart, really plugged in type 1 diabetic to do this, right? Because remember, type 1 diabetics don't make any insulin whatsoever. They have to have exogenous insulin to survive. And so if you start talking about fasting, then what happens is those people's blood sugars drop and they don't really have all the systems like the rest of us do to elevate that blood sugar. And so you really gotta watch out. So I would say type 1 diabetics, pregnant people, and then anybody that has a history of an eating disorder, I would advise against this, right? That's just too much. Now, who's it for? Well, I think it's for the rest of us. In addition to the way we talked about implementing it, I think another really nice thing about it is we always talk about how the two things that really seem to matter most, whether it's diet or exercise or probably just life in general, are intention and consistency. And I think with this, if you have a set period, whether it's 11 in the morning to 7 in the evening, like I suggested, or whatever 8-hour window you pick, whatever it is, if you do that and you stick with it, you're following a consistent pattern. And with the discipline that comes from not eating for those 16 hours, that just shows the intention. And I think that intention is then magnified the following day in your 8-hour feeding period, because you would think you would get to the end of 16 hours and you're like, oh man, I'm starving. I'm going to go eat everything and just raid your refrigerator, pull out a half gallon of ice cream and go. But I think just the opposite for most of us, right? You've put yourself through that discipline of that 16 hours. And so when that next 8 hours comes, you're hungry and you're ready to eat, but you also understand that you just fasted. You just did something good for yourself.
And so you don't want to just completely undo it. So maybe you make a little bit better decisions during that 8 hours. Maybe you don't even intend to, you just do. And again, the intention of following through oftentimes just begets more intention and better decision making. That's what I got on intermittent fasting. It's really interesting. I've known a couple people that have done it and met with great outcomes. I don't see a huge downside to it. I think it's very manageable. I do think that it probably takes a little bit of work to go into, particularly if you're one that just eats a lot. And if you're doing it for weight loss and you're overweight or obese, there's a good chance that you fall into that category. But again, a little bit of intention and a lot of consistency sure takes you a long way. So I hope today's episode was beneficial. If you have any comments on intermittent fasting, I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for joining. Talk to you next time on the BMI.
I'm your host, Dr. Drew Crawford. Join me next week as we go beyond measurements and image to build healthier lifestyles and elevate your well-being on the BMI Podcast. See you then.